So, Flatland, for those of you who have never actually read the book and have just had some nerd explain it to you, then you probably thought it was like 80% mathy stuff and 20% interdimensional sphere gods, and I don't blame you. I was one of these people too once. But then I actually read the book and realized that it probably spends a little bit less than half of its time on mathy stuff, and the rest of it, mostly, on weird shape politics. So let's talk about it. The main meat and potatoes of the book's weird politics are derived from the pseudo-feudalistic model that the shapes follow. Basically what it is the circular shapes are at the tippy top. Stuff like octagons, hexagons, pentagons, the like, are a bit lower than that. Squares are under them. And the only thing worse than a triangle is a line. As you can see, your position in this model depends on what kind of shape you are, the number of sides that you have. Which makes sense at first, like, if you're looking at it like this, then that would be the clearest way to distinguish them. But you need to remember that they don't see their world like this. They see it like this, approximately. Under no circumstances, short of divine intervention, would a two-dimensional shape be able to see the entire form of another two-dimensional shape, which would make it rather difficult for them to actually count the sides. Of course, the book realizes this and comes up with some very clever alternatives. Basically, if you wanted to tell a square from a pentagon, you would have to feel one of their angles, and since all the angles of a regular shape are the same, you would use that information to calculate in your head what kind of shape you're dealing with here. That's also probably why they have such a distaste for irregular shapes, but we'll get to that later. So while, yes, you would be able to do this, it would also be very difficult, and you would need a lot of practice. I think just creating a new model for power would be a lot less hassle. I actually came up with a pretty good analogy to demonstrate just how silly this idea really is. And that's by using actual racism for comparison. So let's say, hypothetically, that one day everyone just magically turned into a walking, talking skeleton. Nobody would have any skin, and as such, they wouldn't have a skin color. This means that if you, for some reason, wanted to keep racism going in its traditional form, you would have to come up with some very clever alternatives. One thing you could do was to judge people based on the shape of their skull instead. This would work to an extent because, for the most part, different races do have differently proportioned skulls. But if you wanted to do this, you would have to be extremely dedicated to racism. You would need to learn and study for years, and one day you would have to pass this knowledge down to the next generation. You would have to teach them the intricate details on how to tell a Scandinavian skull from a Brazilian one. You could do it, but there really wouldn't be a point, and I'm pretty sure after a couple of generations, people would just stop caring. But it's not just this feudalist model that doesn't make any sense, it's also the people that are against the feudalist model that don't make any sense. Let's talk about the color war. Basically, this was a political revolution where a bunch of class abolitionists started to paint all of their sides a different color to express individualism and stick it to the man. But I don't really get how doing this was like an anti-class system, because it actually would have made it a lot easier. Instead of having to painstakingly measure the degrees of an angle for every person you met, you could simply do a quick 360 around them and just count all the different colors you saw, and boom, you know what you're dealing with. Going back to the skeleton analogy, it'd be like if one of the skeletons was like, you know what guys, I'm tired of being judged based on the shape of my skull. And then, to solve this, they started painting themselves in a color that was assigned to whatever shape of skull they had, and then, oh dang it, now we just have normal racism with extra steps. Now finally I wanted to talk about the shapes policy for deformed fellas and unusual individuals. It's pretty simple really. Basically, if you're born with any kind of birth defect, then you will be abducted, slaughtered, and eaten by the upper class. This seems simple enough, but if you stop and think about the execution of this, then you'll probably run into some problems. For example, what qualifies as deformity? One of your sides being too long or too short, that's all. Which, again, isn't exactly the most noticeable thing in the world for these shapes. I'm pretty sure that if one of these irregulars just casually passed by, you probably wouldn't even notice it was irregular. To test this, how about we do a little experiment? I'll have a few shapes cross the screen and you'll only be able to see the frontmost sides. For example, if this triangle passed you, all you'd be able to see was this. Okay, now, which of these shapes are irregular? Alright, answer time. Which shapes did you guess were irregular? Ha, guess what? All of them were. What I'm saying is that these freaks aren't exactly like the Elephant Man or anything like that. They're more like a man whose face is slightly too small for his head. It's not immediately obvious. Really, I think the only way that they could feel sure they've taken care of all of those dirty irregulars was to parole the maternity ward or something and measure the sides right after they came out of the womb. But again, I feel like this would be more trouble than it was worth, and the practice would last maybe a few generations before being abandoned. In short, shapes are silly. Now, as I wrap this up, I will leave you with some wise words from Pythagoras. Every triangle is a love triangle if you love triangles. Sayonara.